Hi, everyone. Welcome today to OCHA is organizing today's panel on From Digital Promise to Frontline Practice, New and Emerging Technologies in Humanitarian Action. And this panel is really about a report that we launched earlier this year. Whom I've invited today are the technical experts that we consulted in pulling this report together. So we really look forward to discussing with you today new and emerging technologies in humanitarian action. With me, I have Ria, who is the lead preparedness officer for the World Food Programme's Emergency Telecom Cluster. I have Andrew, who is the VP of Research and Analysis from Direct Relief, Zoe, a Senior Insights Manager for Mobile for Humanitarian Innovation at GSMA, and Alex, who leads the Crisis Response and Humanitarian Aid at google.org. So welcome, panelists. Thank you for being here today. And let me just start really quickly because I want to leave as much time as possible for our panelists and also for questions and answers at the end. The report that we have here that we're talking about today, actually it's not the report that we're talking about it, but it's about the content of the report, is about new and emerging technologies and how they have the potential to support a shift, a transformation in the way that humanitarians work, moving us from reaction to anticipation to enable earlier, faster, potentially more effective humanitarian action. Obviously, with that sort of with that, of course, comes an array of complex challenges and risks. And this, I think, is what we focus some of our report on, is it's not all about shiny, bright tech, but it's also about these challenges and risks that we need to address as humanitarians as we move forward in our work. What are some of those risks? Inadequate data protection, which can harm, intensify insecurities, hinder principled delivery of humanitarian action. Unequal connectivity and access to technology and digital literacy. I think this is something that Zoe will speak to in a bit. Incomplete data sets about affected people can lead to data discrimination, right? It's hard to do some of the work that we want to do with technology when we don't have good data. What you get out of it is as good as the data that you put into it. And then also, technologies can malfunction, they can break down, and they can sow mistrust, as we've seen in the COVID-19 response. Technology's potential is only as strong as that data set that goes into it, the decision-making process, and then the user distribution and political buy-in into the technology. In the past decade, we've seen a recognition of information in humanitarian emergencies and how this can drive better decision-making. And we do believe that in the future, technology will enable us to go even farther, faster. But that it's not, the solution is not tech in and of itself, right? That there are, to do this responsibly, there are 7 conclusions that we came up with in the report that need to be considered as enablers to technology uptake in the humanitarian space. First, it's inclusion and localization. How do we bridge the digital divide to ensure that local approaches and local communities are at the center of what we do? That we have this people-centered design and leadership to identify the high-tech, low-tech, or no-tech solution that fits the populations that we work with. That we prioritize data capacity and skills so that we ensure that those basics are in place before we try to launch off in this brave new world. Of course, data responsibility and the humanitarian principles of do no harm feature very prominently in our work, and that at first and foremost, we have to do no harm and respect the humanitarian principles that ensure data responsibility and data protection. Collaboration and coordination is key to our work, that this is across humanitarians, across sectors, across the private sector, NGOs, local communities. How do we collaborate and coordinate effectively? Of course, law and policy. I think we've seen this more sharply in recent months, that we need to take a rights-based approach to technology to ensure that international law, human rights law, and ethical standards are applied, especially with the vulnerable communities that we work with. And finally, the final enabler that we identified was investment in scaling. How do we measure the impact of a sustainable investment in this area so that we can generate scalable long-term technology goals? So that's just a brief summary of the report. And what I'd like to do now is hand over to the panelists to describe their work and what they see as most relevant in this space and what can be learned for peacekeeping contexts as well. So for this, I'd like to first hand over to Ria. Please provide a short introduction of yourself and then let us know what it is that you're working on at WFP and where do you see these enablers fit in with your work.
Thank you so much, Quynh, and it's a pleasure to join you all today. And I also would like to thank the NYU and event management team for the chance to be here. It's great to be present digitally from the Dominican Republic, where we are working with the National Center of Emergency Operations to enhance their technological readiness to disasters. By way of short introduction, I'm the lead preparedness officer with the Emergency Telecommunication Cluster, or the ETC for short. This cluster is one of the coordination mechanisms of the United Nations for Emergency Preparedness and Response, and the World Food Programme, which is the UN specialized agency on issues of food security, logistics, and telecoms, is the lead on this matter. So with that short intro, let me begin by saying as well, buenos dias, bonjour, for those tuning in French and Spanish. We live in times of promise fueled by technology. I think that's an indisputable fact. But we also live in times of complex, multi-layered crises. It's quite tempting to view technology as an elixir, as a provider of rapid, immediate solutions to pressing planetary problems, like a change in climate, for management of disaster risks, and also for quelling conflict. However, this is my feeling as well, is that the optimism which comes with technological application would really do well to be tempered by context and be primarily driven by the needs of end users. Indeed, I believe this is also what drives technological development, design, and application in the World Food Programme. So in my reflection today, I will be sharing some perspectives from my work as the Global Preparedness Officer, part of the World Food Programme-led Emergency Telecoms Cluster. As Quynh alluded to earlier, I had the immense pleasure of being a contributing author to the 2021 OCHA report on digital promise to frontline practice. One key message from this writing emphasized that technology's utility is being determined by high applicability and intrinsic value for serving the field. That is, more remote locations that could be in a pre or post disaster or conflict scenario. Within the emergency telecoms cluster, we have worked tirelessly to design and develop tech solutions which do exactly this. For instance, my colleagues have created a chatbot named Mila. And I think one of the developers for this amazing work is on the call today. Hi, Maria. Practically applied in responding to callers to their COVID-related questions in Libya. And this app is special because it's powered by AI and it's available in both Arabic and English. This kind of bi-directional tech, which allows for conversation between the recipients of the messages and those that are generating them, really, in effect, bolsters access of Libyans to key information on local humanitarian services in times of need for credible information. However, whilst we look at interesting tech solutions that are built off of this innovative space of AI, we also do consider that new tech may often rely on national communication networks and backbone infrastructure. So this means that any new tech cannot be introduced without considering existing communication network systems, infrastructure, and even related capacities of personnel that might be operating these said technologies. So in Mongolia, as part of our disaster preparedness services and telecoms, we are supporting the national government with an early warning system review, which is focused on last mile telecoms connectivity support, targeting hazard-exposed vulnerable communities. And the reason why I select this example is that tech doesn't exist in a vacuum, but it's developed in a complex ecosystem that already has interlinked pieces within it. And when we consider tech as an organic entity that's growing and evolving as we grow and evolve, connected to other parts of a system, then our interventions have a rootedness and fit for purpose quality that makes them work effectively, even in crisis conditions. Another aspect which Quynh also mentioned in the opening remarks was on the low code / no code element. And what we're seeing is that some exciting fit for field tech solutions are often low code and even in some cases no code. And another recent writing which the Digital Humanitarian Network in OCHA have been releasing and working on emphasize that the density and complexity of a tech solution doesn't necessarily translate into efficacy or fit for field applicability. In fact, a lesser spoken of trend is rising low tech and no code solutions, which often use, interestingly, older generations of technology that sometimes meet humanitarian or development goals more effectively. So for instance, in Mozambique, post the 2019 tropical cyclones, as a cluster, we provided community radio sets and operation support. And these community radio networks and personnel that operated them became a lifeline for impacted communities beyond the post-crisis of these disasters. And they also served as a trusted early warning mechanism, as well as a reliable source of disaster-related preparedness and response advisory. So in this forum today, where I'm joined by amazing panelists with tremendous tech development and application experience, together with you all in the audience from all over the world, let's think about those who are unable to be present with us digitally or in person today. There is still a significant proportion of the world's population that's digitally disconnected, some of which are not even digitally literate, which is a sobering and concerning fact. Almost half of the world's population, approximately 2.9 billion people, the majority of them women, and most in developing countries, are still offline. So 2.9 billion people still offline. As we explore new and emerging tech applications in this workshop for humanitarian goals, we must keep putting context, applicability, and value cemented by digital literacy at the forefront of any and indeed all tech solutions. That's my key message for today. I do hope my intervention provides some useful food for thought in this session. And I'm grateful for your attention today. Et gracias por su atención. Merci por votre attention. Thank you for your time. Quynh, over to you.
Thanks very much, Ria. And we look forward to coming back to some of those issues that you brought up. Andrew, if I could hand over to you to talk about the work of direct relief. And, I think especially you were going to talk a little bit about the most recent COVID-19 response that you guys have been engaged in.
Sure, thanks, Quynh. And thanks again to the folks at NYU. Just to give a little bit of quick introduction, Direct Relief is a global humanitarian nonprofit organization, principally working in medical supply chain in humanitarian context. I also am the co-founder of an organization called WeRobotics, which also contributed to this report, and from a different angle. And I co-direct a project with colleagues at Harvard School of Public Health called Crisis Ready, which I will talk about in my remarks here as well. I mean, I guess what I wanted to think about or introduce as a topic is some of the data issues that I think Quynh in particular mentioned at the top. And the experience of the pandemic has really, I think, brought a lot of that into pretty stark relief. A number of us have been working for 10 plus years on how to be able to take the really remarkable growth in digital signals, particularly from devices as the mobile internet has grown, and turn those into useful information that can help to guide solutions for public good. And so the pandemic didn't create that situation, didn't create that opportunity, but it really dramatically accelerated it. Right at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw Google releasing their mobility reports, Facebook doing likewise, building on work that had happened in disaster relief, advertising technology, just this explosion of new release of forms of digital data that could allow for understanding population trends at real time, in real time at scale. And the goal of that really was to understand this unprecedented policy context, right? So all of a sudden the world is shutting down. There was a series of policy orders around social distancing and other non-pharmaceutical interventions, and there was a need to understand what kind of response was occurring, and then to integrate that into epidemiology so that there's modeling work that could happen at scale in near real time to understand not only the potential effect of those non-pharmaceutical interventions across virtually every country on Earth, but also to then be able to proxy the contact rate for infection and to begin integrating more of this real-time change dynamic into the models that we use to understand how COVID was affecting the world. And a lot of this during the course of the pandemic also then got integrated into disaster response. So, our group at Crisis Ready was, principally focused around the pandemic, but also were enlisted into response to the hurricanes and wildfires in the United States, in the earthquake in Haiti, in in a range in the volcanic eruption in the Grenadines, St. Vincent, and I could go on and on. Right, the applications are very broad, but one of the things we've consistently discovered is these limitations as well. So in addition to the idea that this is a new type of real-time signal that can provide insight into change dynamics that we've never been able to really get our heads around before, we've also found that, that is a huge localization challenge. Ideally, we should have counterparts in country that are contributing to this work. We should have people, in disaster affected contexts that are also able to provide context and meaning to the kind of signals that we're seeing from the mobile internet and from other sources. That is very hard to do. There's been a hollowing out of the state in many cases, in certain fragile settings in particular. So it really foregrounds the need to build capacity in addition to using new digital signals. Otherwise, this type of work, even in humanitarian context, is going to produce a much greater widening of the digital divide. And it may actually produce information that looks sophisticated, but is not actually informed by the needs of the local population. And we really need to design against that. That's a set of design choices that we make, not just something that accidentally happens. So I'll cut to the chase. We kind of frame this around, 3 dimensions of what we call readiness, to try to think about like what would be required to make this stuff, to design against the problems that I just talked about. One is data readiness. So when we're talking about large scale data sources from private companies, these require legal agreements, they require privacy protections, they require a whole set of affordances around how to use them. And they require the ability to manage very large flows of information, much larger than what most humanitarian organizations and governments are capable of dealing with. That's just a capacity challenge that goes way beyond what we're used to. So that's one. Second is methods readiness, where we have to be able to plug that data into tested methodologies that have, past scientific rigor, that have been used in other circumstances, that address the foreground questions that people in local response contexts have, so that we're not just going through research projects when a crisis happens. And there was a lot of that at the beginning of COVID, but that's okay. But nevertheless, we need to be able to drive that according to tested methodology, so we can get information out that's people can rely on, that we believe has veracity, truth, all of that kind of stuff. And the last is translational readiness. And I really want to emphasize this as the kind of the heart of the matter, hopefully one of the things that things like this conference are helping to forward, and that is that we've got to have networks in place well in advance of emergencies happening, so that we're engaging the academic community in those countries, we're engaging government, we're engaging the range of civil society stakeholders, including organizations like Direct Relief and World Food Program and OCHA, et cetera, so that we have common languages, we have common understandings, we have kind of developed understanding of which are the priorities around models and around the types of work that need to happen. And that translational readiness is an ongoing, very material kind of development that we need. And so that is how I think, doing that well moves us towards localization of the outcome of these much more large-scale global dynamics that have seen this accumulation of data. And I will kind of end it there, and happy to talk about stuff later.
Great, thank you so much, Andrew, for that. That was really rich and already raises a whole bunch of interesting follow-ups for that. I'm going to pass over to Zoe now, who is with GSMA. And Zoe, I think as Andrew's talked about data and Maria's talked about sort of the context where we work, I think you're going to talk a little bit about the people that we work with, right? And some of that focus. So please tell us about GSMA and the work that you're doing and your priorities there.
Great, thanks so much, Quynh. Hi, everyone. My name is Zoe Hamilton. I'm a little bit sick today, so please excuse my voice. I'm a Senior Insights Manager at the GSMA on the Mobile for Humanitarian Innovation team. Our team looks specifically at how to leverage mobile technology to accelerate the delivery and impact of humanitarian aid. Within that, we do that in a variety of ways. First, through advocacy, creating an enabling policy environment. Second, through strategic partnerships, providing innovation funding and strategic support to help the private sector and mobile network operators partner with humanitarian organizations. And third, where I sit in the research and insights team, we look both internally in our portfolio and across the wider digital humanitarian space to identify lessons learned and fill evidence gaps. And one area that our team is particularly interested in, that's come up a few times today, is the digital divide and risks of digital exclusion. So I thought I would share a few thoughts about that today. So as we know, as humanitarian support is increasingly digitized and relying on digital channels, there's a risk of further marginalizing populations that are already marginalized by delivering support and information through channels that might be inaccessible to them. For example, our team has done some research specifically on women and people with disabilities. We know that both of these groups have lower rates of mobile phone access and ownership. In 2019, we conducted research entitled The Digital Lives of Refugees in 3 different humanitarian settings. And our team quantified the mobile gender gap and the mobile disability gap for what we believe was the first time in humanitarian context. And for example, we found in Bidi Bidi settlement in Uganda, women were 47% less likely to own mobile phones than men. And people with disabilities were 13% less likely than people without disabilities. Additionally, we know that for both groups, this gap widens for more advanced use cases. That is, the gap is smaller for relatively simpler functions on a phone, but it increases as you get to more complicated services and functions. Going back to Bidi Bidi, for example, women are just as likely to make phone calls as men, but they're 87% less likely to use their phone to conduct business and 100% less likely to use their phones for things like navigation. So why do these gaps exist? From our research, we know what some of these barriers are. First, access. Things like gatekeepers, lack of accessible devices, or lack of access to requisites like energy can all prevent usage of mobile technology. Second, knowledge and skills, including digital and functional literacy, can increase gaps. Third, affordability, both of handsets and of service usage can be prohibitively expensive. Fourth, relevance. There can be a lack of relevant content for these groups. Services and products might not be available in local or accessible ways to these groups. And then fifth, safety and security, both in terms of perceptions and in terms of the reality. Mobile devices can put these groups at at increased risk. So these barriers are not unique to marginalized populations, but they can have more acute effects and can be more common among marginalized populations. For example, who might not have as much access to livelihood or educational opportunities. But of course, these barriers are context specific. These 5 barriers that I've identified today will vary greatly from one context to another. And to reduce the risk of digital exclusion, the first step is really understanding what specific barriers exist in each context, disaggregated by group, in order to address them effectively. So the first fundamental way of doing this is conducting research. The GSMA, the ETC, and REACH put out last year the Connectivity Needs and Usage Assessment Toolkit, which is one way to collect this data. We call it Conua. Conua provides the tools to help organizations understand mobile phone access, usage, preferences, and digital skills amongst populations of concern in a robust and standardized way. It provides both qualitative and quantitative tools that organizations can use according to their needs. Collecting this disaggregated data is really the first step to understanding the drivers of the digital divide and therefore addressing it. From there, organizations can target specific barriers, for example, by providing digital literacy training, providing energy solutions, or affordable handsets. Another GSMA tool that might be useful, we have what's called MIST toolkit, which is specifically for digital literacy training. And there's a number of different modules that can be used depending on user needs and interests. In addition to designing programming to target specific barriers, another way to create inclusive digital programming is through human-centered design, or what Quynh mentioned at the beginning. By using human-centered design and co-creating products and services, the specific needs of users can be taken into account by working with the populations themselves to design and implement inclusive services. So using a highly participative, creative approach to problem solving, you put users at the center, and this is especially important when designing programming with marginalized groups, because it can help us understand the intersectional challenges that they face, especially when researchers or program designers aren't from the same background. It's super important to have a robust methodology in place to understand the barriers and to address them. Of course, there are many different ways of addressing the digital divide. It's important to be cognizant of the divide when using digital tools to research and understand the drivers and effects, and to integrate those into programming. I think that it's fair to say that digital technologies aren't going anywhere, and our role is to mitigate the harms and to ensure that everybody has safe and equitable access to the tools and services available, and to ensure that we're not creating new harms or further exacerbating existing inequalities. So I'll end there and hand back to Quynh.
Great, thank you so much for that. And again, the digital divide was one of the really big things that we relied on GSMA's research for in our report that we did. So thank you for that. Alex, I will hand over to you now to give us a little bit of introduction about google.org, the work that you're doing there, the work that Google has done, google.org has done to contribute to sort of technology in this humanitarian space. And I'm guessing you probably have a couple of lessons learned in this public-private partnership world that we live in, and will need to increase, frankly, in the future if we're really going to make the most out of technology. So over to you, Alex.
Thanks, Quynh, and thanks NYU, the organizers, and excited to be on this panel with such esteemed colleagues and people I'm huge fans of. My name is Alex Diaz. I work at google.org, which, if you're like me, I had no idea it really existed before I joined. Google.org is the company's philanthropy. And what the team does is work to support nonprofits that are on the front line with grant dollars and with volunteer support. And specifically within the crisis space, which is the area that I lead, our main mission is to work to support nonprofits that are helping communities better prepare, respond, and recover from crises. Google's broader mission, just to contextualize why our work's important for the company, is to organize the world's information, make it universally accessible and useful. I think I got that right. And there are like many teams at the company working to build products and using our platforms in the vein to just be helpful. So like we have our Google Maps team that works to create things like the Environmental Insights Explorer. We have a whole team on search that creates effective alerting infrastructure and distribution that just kind of gathers all relevant information that might be most helpful in crisis settings. And then we work to support the nonprofit sector in advancing the field, likely through tech-enabled projects. One trend that Quynh hinted at in the top that we're really excited about is the shift from reactivity to proactivity, especially with the worsening climate. I think we all agree a lot more needs to be done in advance of crises. And kind of like what Andrew mentioned, you know, assuming data readiness, methods readiness, and translation ready, there is a huge opportunity to really harness the potential of some of these data streams and data sets and models that are being built to help mitigate loss of lives and livelihoods. Not to minimize all the caveats and risks that we need to take into account, but there is a huge opportunity here. And what I'll do now is just talk a little bit about the role that I think tech can play, the role that I think philanthropy can play, and then a couple of just small examples of work that we've gotten behind that that I hope is being helpful and continues to scale elsewhere. Kind of to touch on Quynh's point in the report, like the tech that is being developed needs to be developed and deployed responsibly, and has to have all these kind of concerns mitigated and thought of from the design phase. But at best, I think technology is a helpful enabler, especially in this world of organizing and making information accessible and being a useful source of aid. It is only as good as it is, one, what data is going into it, and then two, how people are actually using it. But it's clearly it's not a panacea, and I think we need some of that techno-skepticism, that dose of humility when embarking on some of these big ambitious projects. And then some things that I've just learned from projects that, you know, have crossed my desk and that either we've started to support or decline are the following. And maybe it's helpful, maybe it's not, but I'll continue on my soapbox. One is making sure that there isn't a solution in search of a problem. This is something I see all the time, where people want to point to the very shiny thing that can solve the world's problems. I think contrary, we should actually be focusing on well-defined problems with finely scoped solutions. And for someone that is interested in AI, this also means not doing AI for AI's sake. As Quynh noted, there are many, many low-tech or even no-tech solutions, and also RIA, that might be more adequately scoped for the problem that folks are trying to solve. Secondly, those closest to the problem are also very likely most closest to the solution. So we all need to be working to make sure that the most local communities that are impacted by these disasters are engaged, bought in, empowered, driving the development and deployment of this work. And any tech solution that gets brought to bear should be used to augment, not exclude. So making sure that there are rigorous processes in place to debias, to audit the data quality, to abide by do no harm principles. And that if tech is saying being used to help identify, and I'll give an example, who might be eligible for a program, making sure that it's augmenting and working and building upon systems that already exist, that are already operational. And I think bottom line across all of these partnerships are key. There's a role that nonprofits and academia and government, and then of course, private sector and philanthropy can play. And I think we all just need to be open to that and be willing contributors to that. Really quickly on what I think philanthropy can do, given my perch. We have a role specifically, I think, in de-risking and helping build evidence for interesting innovations. We have the ability to provide flexible funding, but I think importantly, no one is voting philanthropists to do what we do. So we need to be working with governments and other institutions that are critical for that long-term sustainability, and of course, like public accountability of the work. Google.org operates a little bit differently than some philanthropies in that we are a corporate philanthropy. And probably our best asset at the company isn't really our money, although it's helpful, it's really our talent. So how can we help bring our talent to projects that are nonprofit led? So our technical talent, i.e. not me, being brought to support folks like Andrew and folks like I saw Sarah on the call here, and the missions that they're leading. And one way in which we do that, we have a fellowship program where we actually send teams of employees on full-time secondment to help build some projects. And that's one way that we take early bets on promising technologies. Critically, we make sure that a lot of that work, if not all that work, is open source, so that one NGO doesn't have a monopoly over interesting solutions, that it's as collaborative and as open as possible so that others can reap the benefits of that work. Now I'll stop rambling and I'll give you 2 quick examples, maybe 3, and then we'll pass back over for a Q&A. I think and the examples I'm going to give are just how I've seen technology be helpful and used in the humanitarian space. The first example I'll talk about is flood forecasting, because I think there's been a huge proliferation and advancement, thankfully, in the field of improving forecasts, especially for hydro events like riverine floods and cyclones. Google's been doing some work in that space, as has others. And I think importantly, we need to, the angle that I come at is, awesome that, the technology exists to improve granularity and lead time. So, a disaster is coming with a little bit more lead time and where exactly is going to get hit. But then how do you make sure that that information gets piped through whatever systems currently exist that need to be enforced or strengthened or what have you, to make sure that the folks that are most vulnerable in that disaster's path get that information with enough time to take mitigative action. So we've been thinking about early warning systems and roles that we can play and the nonprofit system can play in doing exactly that, especially using offline mechanisms, whether that's beating drums or using radio or WhatsApp group chats, kind of having a little bit of an experimental approach at a small scale to see what's actually been working, and then working to share those learnings with others in the sector. And then one technical solution or intervention that I've seen catch steam in the last year has to do with work that we've supported in cash transfers. Google.org has been a long proponent of cash transfers as an intervention, not necessarily again as a panacea, but as a intervention that we think should be a larger percentage of the package of goods that currently are deployed in response to or in advance of disasters. And in a cash transfer system, there's like 3 broad steps. There's like targeting who the vulnerable folks are, helping them enroll them in a system, and then actually doing the payout. And one thing that we've been working on is trying to innovate on that targeting. How do we help identify with a little bit more granularity or with broader recall folks that are vulnerable and can be eligible for cash transfer programs? And one example that I'll highlight was led by the Togolese government in partnership with NGOs like Give Directly and academics like folks at UC Berkeley, is called Novissi, N-O-V-I-S-S-I. And what they use is a combination of satellite imagery data that looked at things like roofing material or proximity to critical infrastructure as proxies for relative wealth. But then also layered in kind of what Andrew was talking to, some cell phone data signals that could also be helpful proxies when combined with these other data sets for geographic areas or households, relative wealth. Again, critically to augment, not to reduce existing social protection systems. And what the government found was in a matter of weeks, as opposed to months, with I think 5 staff, as opposed to the many others that would need to go door to door for proxy means testing, they were able to disperse millions of dollars in aid to hundreds of thousands of families. So interesting space. And if you can see like flood forecasting and then now this innovation in targeting and cash coming together, one area that I'm excited about is anticipatory action, specifically anticipatory cash, where now a disaster is coming with some level of lead time, with some level of granularity, and then now you can turn on another system that says, where are the vulnerable folks in that area? How do we get them enrolled, and then give them cash critically before peak floods or peak disaster hits, and see if that has some effect in mitigating loss of lives and livelihoods. And I'll say all that to say one of my latest grants that I'm extremely excited about is work that we are supporting out of OCHA and the Center for Humanitarian Data, and work that they're doing to scale anticipatory action programs around the world and critically fill 3 gaps that they've identified as limiting factors to the uptake around the world. They being data gaps. So making sure that, these models are only as good as the data goes into them. So making sure that we are working to advocate and unlock data sets that could be helpful in this space. Trust gaps, so making sure that models that are in the pipeline are being deployed, are peer reviewed, are de-biased, are going through all the rigorous processes that they should be going through from a principal's perspective to make sure that they're not adding to or exacerbating any additional biases in the space. And then third, especially for long-term sustainability, building capacity. So making sure that all the relevant authorities at national and subnational level are getting the training that they need to be actually to develop, deploy, and sustain these types of systems. So I'll stop there and excited for Q&A.
Thanks so much, everyone. That was fantastic, and I think, as I'd hoped that I would be able to keep my intervention short, and that you all would sort of make the findings of the report much more interesting and come alive than I could in a summary. I would just wanted to invite participants to put questions into the chat, and from there we'll go with a couple of questions. But before we do that, I just wanted to turn back to the panelists and see if you wanted to react to anything that you heard from your fellow panelists, and just if there was anything that really piqued your interest that you wanted to react to. Andrew, I see that your mic is on, so maybe you're ready to
well, that's
react
sort of deceptive, actually, because I do use the physical thing.
Right.
But I'm happy to respond. I mean, I think that all of these actually, it's interesting to me that we all kind of gravitate to many of the same directions for different reasons and from actually very different backgrounds and directions. I think as Alex was pointing out, this question around, being able to get an appropriate prioritization of need, which I think is one of the things that is, and have that really driven locally, and then have the technology support that local prioritization of need. To me, that's actually a lot of what's at stake in the cash transfer question, is to say, well, we can make a certain number of decisions about what ought to be needed or what might be needed, but the ability to be able to make localized resource allocation decisions is in many cases a much better way to do that. And then you need to use technology to support, well, how do you facilitate the ability to make those localized resource allocation decisions, and how can we kind of bring that to bear? I mean, I work part of the time in things, I think there are limits to that. I mean, like, for instance, in direct relief works closely with the pharmaceutical industry, and so sometimes there are things you can't buy locally, and so just giving cash doesn't actually solve the problem of access to certain kinds of goods. Like if the gap is that a cancer hospital has been rendered inoperable for some reason, and you need to rebuild the drug supply, that's not going to necessarily be bought off the local market. So we need to be able to understand what are the kind of things that can be plugged in alongside those kind of local prioritization matrices. And to me, that backs all the way up to the question around kind of the conceptual framework for how we use the data we do have to actually understand how those two different kinds of pieces and prioritizations fit together, so that we're able to understand what is changing, how has a situation evolved, what should we be understanding out of models for anticipating relative impacts, so that we can understand different kinds of sectoral needs. That's something that's gone on for a long time, but we have all kinds of these new tools to bring to bear on it. And I think, we can do that without doing what Zoe's talking about in terms of then exploding the digital divide over who gets to actually use the data, which then also becomes this prioritization question.
Fantastic, thanks for that. Zoe, Alex, did you want to come in on that, or should I go to questions from our participants?
I mean, maybe just reacting as well. I think I agree with Andrew. There were a lot of really common themes throughout all of our all of our comments. But one that I really liked was, I mean, I think that the the research element from what I was talking about really fits with, you know, sometimes high tech, low tech, or no tech. And that's something that our team really advocates, that even though we're the GSMA and we're obviously all about mobile technology and the use of technology, it's only when it's appropriate, and that is not in all contexts. So we've done a large amount of research on the use of mobile money in cash transfer programming, and understanding in what context and with what preconditions is that appropriate. And then going back to the user perspective, making sure that users have local agents available, that cash floats are available within that context, that people have phones, or if as you know, Give Directly does, you're supplying handsets, that people know how to use them and know how to use them safely. So I think that human-centered design element can be applied to all of these conversations as well.
Great, thank you. Sorry, just I want to actually go to this question really quickly, Alex, before I give you an opportunity to come in. But this is a question from the participants, and it's about tech infrastructure for cash transfer. So what you both Andrew and Zoe, what you've both been talking about is, it looks like one of the applications in the peacebuilding context is to use cash transfers to fund local peace builders and organizations, right? Rather than what we do in the humanitarian context is usually fund individuals, right? We identify a group of refugees and we provide them with cash directly. What about this idea about funding peace builders or local communities, local organizations? And this gets us back to the whole localization and moving our response from, you know, this very international HQ to moving it to local actors and local responders. Do any of you have experience in that? No, so in the humanitarian context. Oh, Andrew, go ahead.
I was going to defer to Alex actually, since he's the cash guy. But Alex, did you want to take that, or?
I was going to say no other analogous examples that I'm aware of from the work that we supported, other than, you know, we have been providing like flexible financing and grant dollars to like small and medium-sized businesses, but to completely different use case, completely different context.
I don't have any experience with you know, funding peace building organizations either, except to say that I do think that it's important. I mean, often one of the problems is being able to effectively have a, you know, kind of vetting of all of the various organizations involved in these kinds of activities. So, you know, that is, I think, sometimes seen as a bit of a challenge in terms of conflict settings where financial transfers into organizations has a number of specific legal requirements associated with it. You know, for instance, like as a US organization, we have to comply with State Department regulations around the, you know, counterterrorism regulations for organizations. And that's a whole kind of formal vetting process that has to go on. So, you know, and often peace building organizations are kind of bound up within this whole context. Lots of fantastic groups that really should receive support. How do we minimize the friction to transfer resources while maximizing the ability of funding organizations to comply with all of the available regulations that we have to comply with as well? And I think that to me is kind of maybe gets parked on the preparedness side. So like flagging that as an issue in advance, how much of that can be known, you know, well in advance? How do we make sure that it's really clear as to what are the backgrounds, who are the participants, how do people interconnect, so that we can minimize some of that regulatory friction towards some of those transactional issues in the very sensitive environments where that question would be most relevant.
Great, thanks for that. And that was exactly the point that I was going to make, is that for us as humanitarians, the big thing is about vetting, right? Who do we give our funds to, local partners? And that is that is a difficult question for all the points that you raised, Andrew. Let's see, Alex, I didn't give you a chance to come back on what you've heard today from the panelists. Was there anything that you wanted to react to?
I'll cede the floor to a few of the questions. I think Zoe and Andrew covered what I was going to say reaction-wise well.
Great. Okay, thank you. Zoe, let me just ask you a question then about some of the risks of exclusion, like for people with disabilities, for instance, right? How can technology, we've talked about how technology can, without being intentionally exclude people, right? We can see that. How can we use technology then to include populations?
Great question. Yeah, I mean, I think that this segment of the population in general is one that's not taken into account enough in humanitarian action. We know worldwide there's about 12 million people that are forcibly displaced. And within humanitarian context, these populations are at increased risk as the settings can present unique challenges. And as mobile technology has increased, we've already talked about some of the risks, but there are potential ways that technology can be inclusive as well. Assistive technology is an umbrella term that we use to cover the systems and services related to the delivery of assistive products and services. So they can, for example, maintain or improve an individual's functioning and independence, promoting their well-being. To do this, groups need to really take people with disabilities into account in design functions. And I think, for example, some of the low tech examples that have been mentioned today can be deployed. So just to give you a few examples, M-Pesa, which is Safaricom's mobile money service in Kenya, has an integrated IVR channel that allows people with visual impairments to check their balance. To reduce fraud, because they noticed that was a complaint of their customers that there was a risk of fraud from agents when they couldn't see the transactions that were happening. Likewise, Turkcell in Turkey has a video-enabled customer service support line for people with hearing impairments. Or finally, the third example I'll give is Be My Eyes connects people with visual impairments to sighted volunteers through video call for visual assistance that's free of charge. And so I think that mobile technology, while it does present risks, can also provide this opportunity for humanitarians to access relatively low-tech assistive technologies that can include these populations as well if the right steps and design choices are made.
Thanks for that. I'm going to take this opportunity and ask actually Andrew and Alex a question about data and sort of, Alex, you were already talking about anticipatory action and predictive analytics and the work that we're doing in OCHA on this. And after completing this report on technologies, I started working on a report for OCHA on climate change. And so in climate change, what we're looking at now, of course, it's the impact of climate change on humanitarian need. And I'm just wondering what you guys think about how do we expand on the opportunities with tech to predict and analyze, project longer term climate impacts on humanitarian need, taking into consideration all the cascading and compounding challenges that go into climate, right, in the humanitarian context, displacement, conflict, low to no basic services. How can we use tech in this context? Beyond just the anticipatory action, just beyond forecasting, but maybe even all the way down to projections.
Yeah, great question. I could take many different angles to it because I think there's so much that can and needs to be done. I think from the basic, for many places where historical data does not exist, I think projections become harder. So how can we, to the extent we can recreate that, if that's even possible with high level fidelity, or even just start getting some of that data collection that's necessary for some of these predictive models get off the ground. And I think interesting and new ways to also distribute information. One thing that comes to mind is I know like our Android team, for example, has been working to leverage Android phones. Like a lot of Android phones, or I think many Android phones have like a built-in accelerometer inside. And another use case for the accelerometer is it can detect very, very tiny movements. When taken at like a scale of, say, like a city or a county, if all the Android phones in a particular area are shaking, either folks set the alarm for the same exact time, or it's like an early signal that an earthquake is about to come or hitting. So can you use that like interesting use case to start to distribute that alert, giving people an extra 15 seconds to say get under the table and take cover. Another interesting use case in that earthquake detection case is companies that have these like subsea cables, where it's very, very, very quiet down on the ocean's depth, but that cable can also be used as like an early earthquake detection because it's far further out to sea, closer to some of these epicenters might be, and can be detected with relative fidelity. So I think there's so much that could be done, but there's new and interesting or repurposed use cases that are relatively low-hanging fruit that people could take advantage of in this space that's beyond just anticipation.
One of the most interesting cases I've seen recently around this projection question in the displacement realm has been around being able to use mobility data plus remote sensing to actually do forecasts of displaced population from an event. We are getting pretty good, I think, at being able to post hoc understand displaced population, although there's still a lot of work to do on that. But being able to, have increasingly kind of fine-grained projections of how many people, conditional on size of event, where would they go, and then what are the services that would have to be available to respond to them. That, I think, is a really interesting field of research that there's a lot of kind of vibrant activity going on in. A lot of that can build off the research that's already gone on, and I do think that that's a question for being able to regularly ground truth those kinds of questions with actual displacement tracking mechanisms, the ground surveys, things like that. But I do think like prioritizing those questions from a standpoint of humanitarian services under conditions of like increasing climate disasters is just one thing that we can do. I just wanted to note one other thing that occurred to me that I just thought was an interesting topic that kind of was flagged earlier, and that's this no code question. Because it links directly to the capacity issues that we've all kind of, I think, approached from different directions. I mean, the purpose of no code is to be able to democratize the creation of applications, right? And so that make more use of the data that is available. I think that, it's interesting. I think that we kind of have to do both in code and no code. Because one of the things I'm all in favor of being able to expand out the universe of folks that are able to do things with data and are able to design around their particular use cases without necessarily having specialized expertise. Often it's very hard to do things like have enough control over the data to be able to do kind of meaningful applications and kind of scientifically defensible applications without having code in the mix. And there's a kind of parallel kind of development, I think, around expanding out data science training, the use of Python, R, Jupyter notebooks, the universe of tools that, and ArcGIS, for instance, has expanded out their kind of integration of all these things. So there's a lot of it's more accessible than ever before to do this. So we need to think about capacity in a couple of different dimensions here as we build this out. I think that would be rather than preferencing like no code is democratizing, code is less democratizing. I think that you can democratize in both ways.
Great, thank you. And we have 1 minute left, I'm afraid. But since Andrew just got his last word in, without knowing it was going to be his last word, I'm going to give Zoe and Alex a chance here to put your final words into this panel for our peacebuilding partners about what we can apply in their context. Zoe?
Great, thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's been a great session. Thank you so much for hosting it. Thanks to NYU for having us. I think there's a lot going on in the humanitarian space. I hope that we've been able to share some lessons for the peace building space. But I mean, for me, the number one is understand the local context where you're working, because it can vary quite a lot. And building on local systems, building on local capacity, building on user preferences, meeting them where they are, and building capacity where there isn't capacity, because digital's not going anywhere. So we need to make sure that we're building it in a way that's equitable and accessible, and not exacerbating existing inequalities.
Thank you for that. Alex, last words, yours.
Oh man. Plus one to everything that that Zoe and Andrew said. Thank you, Quynh. Thank you, NYU, for having us. I guess to leave on a somewhat positive note, let's not limit our imagination by what currently exists. There are many creative ideas out there on what can be done, and just, you know, Google wants to be helpful, Google.org wants to be helpful. If you have any ideas, just reach out. We're happy to chat and collaborate.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. We're 1 minute over. So with that, I'll say thanks to NYU, thanks to the panelists, and thanks to the organizers for having us. Bye.